Are surrender and self inquiry both two different paths to truth? First, the very word path implies distance. The word path implies that truth is some destination that's away from where we are and we have to get there. And if we look at it closely, that very assumption seems to be based on thought, based on a certain projection of truth as uh, some entity or some state of being or some uh, inner or sometimes even outer destination that can be reached in time and space. But the truth remains that our very being, which is shining the light in which we are functioning, is already present and shining each moment. So there cannot be any distance between us and truth, because if truth were not present here and now, if God is not present here and now, then the question begs to be asked, how are we functioning outside the realm of God or outside the realm of truth? Uh, so clearly, the idea of God or truth as something that's to be attained in time and space and therefore through a path is itself a fallacy. And then the second fallacy is, our surrender and self inquiry two different aspects or two different things. So, first, I think the word process is probably a better word, because there is a process for us to realize the truth. And what is this process? The process is essentially a process of purification. So, a good metaphor to be used, which is used commonly also, is if we have a mirror that is full of dust, it does not reflect our image. We don't have to go anywhere to clean the mirror. There is no path or there is no journey, so to speak, to see the image, and yet the image is not seen. That is the fact. So, what is necessary is a process of purification of the mirror, and that's essentially what we can call sadhana to be, or any kind of meditation practice to be. And that's what self inquiry and surrender are. So, the process of purification is necessary as long as there are vasanas, which is the dust that covers the mirror and prevents the reflection of the image that shines within us eternally. So, that being so, is self inquiry and surrender two different processes? Is another question to explore. And if you look at it closely, it's not so, because one cannot truly surrender without inquiring into the nature of surrender, and one cannot inquire without a sense of surrender that goes with it. So it's more like two sides of the same coin, as opposed to being two different processes. And they both reinforce each other. So surrender is simply a recognition that everything happens on its own and there is no separate doer. If we look at it right now, there is breathing going on, there is blood being circulated, there is so many bodily functions happening. There is no I doing that. There is thoughts happening, and again, if we look closely, there is no I thinking the thoughts. The thoughts are rising. Speech is happening. There is no I speaking, because clearly the language, the physical function of the vocal cords, all of this is happening with no I in charge. All actions similarly are happening with no I in charge. So, this recognition that there is no I who is thinking, speaking, acting, sensing through the senses is both surrender and self inquiry, because it takes some inquiry, because we are normally deluded into thinking that there is an I doing all these actions. And when we recognize through a clear perception that there is no I, it's all happening on its own, then that's inquiry, and that leads to surrender. Because how does it all happen? It happens through the same energy, the same power that activates everything in the universe. So, even in the realm of science, this is why the holy grail for even physics is the one unifying force, because even there is a subconscious recognition that there is one truth that controls every other manifestation of forces in different forms. So we see that intuitively when we look into ourselves, just as a scientist does this outwardly. So when we recognize this, then there is surrender. So this is captured beautifully in a verse in the Gita, which Gita has this so many verses, which even that one verse is enough for understanding the entire wisdom. So this particular verse states that everything happens by the three modes of nature. Only the ignorant thinks I am the doer. The verse is Prakrute Kriyamanani Gunai Karmani Sarvashah Ahankara Vimudhatma Karta Ahamiti Manyate. So, this clear recognition that everything happens through the three modes of nature, and nature is nothing but the power of consciousness. So, consciousness, when it is still, is just without any movement, and consciousness, when it's in movement, is the universe. In um, traditional terms, it's even this is exactly what Shiva and Shakti is referred to as. Shiva is the still consciousness, and Shakti, or the feminine, is the power of consciousness that makes the universe manifest. So, regardless, whichever way we look at it, there is the stillness of consciousness, and there is the movement within consciousness that manifests as the universe. So, when we inquire into the nature of both the movement and the underlying stillness, it is self inquiry and surrender. By the way, the particular verse that that I refer to is from the third chapter, 27th verse in the Bhagavad Gita. So when we look at this truth that every movement happens on its own, and it is from the ground of stillness within, then that is both surrender and self inquiry. So, surrender is not blindly accepting the authority of someone, but surrender is to surrender to the source of life itself within. Of course, if we are able to feel naturally unconditional love for God in any form, or for a pure enlightened being that has the power to turn us within and find our own source of being, which is the same as all that is. But essentially, it is to seek inward our own source of being. And when we surrender to that source, it goes along with inquiry. So, one thing that normally we look at as difficult sometimes is to say that how can I do self inquiry while engaged in the world? Um, Actually, it is not different from surrender, and therefore it can be done all the time. We just have to simply recognize that the automatic process within us that tries to rise up as I and take ownership of our actions is an illusion. That is uh, one way to look at it as inquiry. Or if we see that everything happens on its own, that is surrender. So it's essentially the same thing whichever way we look at it, and therefore then it's not something that is difficult even while we are engaged in the world. We can simply see that things are happening on their own. Every interaction happens on its own, and the false sense of ownership of any interaction, any thought, any speech, any action is the source of our illusion and therefore our suffering. So to see that is both surrender and self-inquiry, and therefore they are not different at all, as we can clearly see. One may appeal more to someone than the other just based on the mood it creates. Surrender seems to have a more um, softer, loving mood to it, perhaps, and self inquiry seems to be a more inquiring mood to it, which may be, um, again, these are difficult to put it. Some might even say one is a very masculine approach and one is a feminine approach, but the truth is both are within us, and therefore um, we don't have to divide the two. As we already said, they are not two different paths, and there is no path even. It's just a process of purification, and both sides of the coin, which we call surrender and self-inquiry, are both um, essentially part of the same process. As long as we are able to see that, then there is no dichotomy between the two. There is no debate between jnana and bhakti. There is no um, conflict of any kind. We are able to relate to the sweetness of unconditional love, which is the essence of self inquiry. And similarly, we are able to have the clarity of wisdom, which is the essence of surrender.